Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a close look at a specific source you, our listener, shared with us. It's an article called After the Deportations, Why the Black Community May Be Next in Trump's America.
Right, and this piece really digs into the idea that the recent sort of intensified immigration enforcement, the stuff targeting the Hispanic community especially, might be doing more than just affecting immigrant groups.
Yeah, it suggests this crackdown is creating this whole climate of fear,
Hmm.
and that this could potentially, pave the way for targeting other marginalized groups. The article focuses specifically on the Black community here.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this source. Our mission, just to be clear, is to explore the points it raises, the historical context it presents, the policies it discusses, potential implications, all just as the article lays it out.
Hmm. We're here to understand what this source argues, presenting its perspective impartially, not, endorsing it ourselves.
Absolutely. And the article kicks things off by grounding its argument in history. It talks about patterns it sees repeating.
Yeah, it's pretty striking. The source argues that, historically, when one vulnerable group gets targeted, it often sets a kind of precedent for others. He doesn't see this as new, but as something that happens again and again.
And it points to some tough historical examples to make this point, like the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. The article argues that was justified by, well, fear and prejudice.
Right, and it draws a line from that back to the forced removal of Native Americans and the enslavement of Black individuals. Really difficult histories.
And the source connects these, arguing they're linked by things like fear-mongering, demagoguery, scapegoating, basically tactics used to consolidate power. It sees a common thread there.
A really crucial point the article makes is how targeting one community then influences how others are seen and treated. It suggests the increased marginalization with Latino deportations has this ripple effect. It amplifies biases, makes other groups, like Black Americans, feel more vulnerable. This whole historical backdrop is presented as a kind of warning sign.
Okay, so moving from that history, the source shifts to concerns it argues are happening right now. It starts by describing what it calls a regime of fear.
Yeah, the argument is that this intensified crackdown on undocumented immigrants has created this fear that spreads, way beyond just the people directly affected.
So it makes other marginalized groups like the Black community feel especially vulnerable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they're already acutely aware of their own long history with systemic racism and oppression. That sense of vulnerability is really central here.
And it points to specific things that reinforce this fear, like the militarization of law enforcement.
Yes, the article talks about this trend, seeing military-style tactics becoming more common in civilian policing, particularly in cities with large Hispanic populations. It specifically mentions Los Angeles, Houston, and Phoenix as places where this is happening, operations involving ICE and local police.
The source gives examples from these cities, right?
It does. For LA, it talks about raids, checkpoints, local police and federal agents doing this, often with little warning. The article characterizes it as creating this constant atmosphere of surveillance and fear. Disrupts families, community stability, that kind of thing.
And Houston, what does it say there?
In Houston, it highlights collaboration between local police and ICE. The argument is this increases tension in neighborhoods, creates a feeling of a police state. And this wariness, it says, goes beyond just immigration. People become hesitant to use public services like healthcare or schools.
Okay, in Phoenix.
Phoenix is also detailed. The source argues this militarized approach makes racial disparities worse, leads to aggressive policing, racial profiling, especially targeting Hispanic citizens. It sees this as undermining social cohesion.
And raises civil rights concerns about all these tactics.
Big time. Across all these cities, it frames them as part of that regime of fear it described earlier.
Okay, so that's the picture the source paints of current enforcement. But it also looks ahead, right, to potential policy shifts. It brings up something called Project 2025.
Yeah, the source describes Project 2025 as this collection of policies it calls radical right-wing. It argues that people concerned about civil rights see this whole agenda as aiming to sort of systematically dismantle existing protections.
And what specific parts of Project 2025 does the source flag as worrying in this context?
Well, it discusses the project's stated goal of targeting institutions considered anti-American, The article suggests this could mean civil rights groups, social justice organizations, things like that. It interprets this as a potential systematic dismantling of the very structures that support marginalized rights.
It also mentions legal protections.
Right. The source is concerned about potentially rolling back legal protections for equal treatment, maybe limiting access to fair legal help, or reversing initiatives meant to address racial disparities in policing or education.
Hmm.
And another critical point it makes is the potential targeting of civic engagement itself, making it harder for communities like Black Americans to advocate for themselves.
And there's another angle, too, about surveillance, specifically targeting Black activists.
Yeah, the article argues there's increasing surveillance of Black activist groups. It explicitly compares this to historical COINTELPRO practices, those past government surveillance programs, creating intimidation, repression, often justified by national security concerns.
How does the source say this is happening now? What are the examples?
It talks about over-policing in Black neighborhoods, using aggressive tactics. It mentions things like no-knock raids, which it says get justified with sort of suspicious justifications about gangs or drugs. The article argues this just destroys trust, creates fear, and basically shuts down grassroots organizing.
And technology plays a role, too.
Yes, the source brings up the ethical issues around more tech surveillance, things like monitoring social media, using facial recognition algorithms. It argues these tools can be used to target activists based on what they do online, undermining peaceful organizing.
So, okay, weaving all this together, the history, the current enforcement, potential future policies, surveillance, the force views the surge in mass deportations as a kind of signal, a bellwether.
That's the term it uses, yeah, a bellwether. It sees the mass deportations targeting the Hispanic community not just as one policy, but potentially as a precursor to broader measures of state violence and racial control.
And the argument is these could easily extend to other marginalized groups.
Right, making the Black community feel particularly vulnerable, especially given the history the article laid out earlier.
The source also mentions public tolerance and the media's role.
It does. It argues that for these kinds of policies to stick, they rely a lot on public tolerance. And it suggests media coverage often focuses more on the enforcement numbers than the human stories, the actual impact, which could, desensitize people and make these systemic issues seem normal.
What about the courts? What does the source say about the judicial response?
It notes the response has been varied. It perceives in some cases a kind of hesitation to really step in robustly against practices that look potentially discriminatory. The article sees this hesitation itself as setting a concerning precedent, especially as state actions become more aggressive.
So the upshot for the Black community, according to this source, is grappling with this fear that they could be next, seeing the current climate as a direct threat tied to those historical patterns.
That's the core argument it builds, but importantly, the source doesn't just end on that note. It also talks about the response, specifically solidarity and resistance.
Okay, so it sees pushback happening.
Definitely. It highlights what it calls a notable increase in solidarity among marginalized groups, particularly strengthening ties between Black-led coalitions and Latino or immigrant communities. It views this as really crucial for building a united front against these perceived threats.
And it gives examples of this solidarity. How does it look on the ground?
Absolutely. It mentions things like mutual aid networks, community volunteers providing basics like food, legal help, healthcare. It talks about joint community events that address shared needs and educate people on issues that cut across groups, like immigration and criminal justice reform, highlighting that intersectionality.
Legal support is part of that, too.
Yes, it points to initiatives like volunteer lawyers, setting up workshops, legal clinics, trying to empower people by informing them about their rights, and also helping to fight back against repression, especially targeting activists.
And protests, demonstrations.
Those too. The source highlights instances where diverse coalitions have come together for protests. It sees these as powerful ways to raise awareness, show unity, demonstrating resilience through collective action rooted in these shared experiences of being marginalized.
Okay, so stepping back, what's the bigger picture the source is trying to paint with all this?
Well, it takes this broader look at power, race, humanity. It argues policies like mass deportation aren't just isolated things, but reflect these ongoing historical injustices. It suggests these events signal a kind of resurgence of dangerously categorizing people hierarchically, devaluing certain groups, especially people of color.
Creating that split between those who get rights and those labeled others or undesirables.
Exactly. The source calls this a troubling continuity throughout history, where race has often been the deciding factor in how people are treated by the state. It really hammers home the profound implications this has for the Black community today and stresses the need for an intersectional understanding, seeing how different forms of oppression connect.
And based on that analysis, the source issues a call to action.
A very clear one. It stresses the urgent need for vigilance, encouraging people to recognize the patterns, the warning signs, as it calls them, seen with immigrant groups. The source basically says the situation is urgent and needs proactive engagement from everyone from all parts of society.
What specific actions does it suggest people can take?
It mentions uniting communities, using both grassroots efforts and bigger platforms to raise awareness, having open discussions, getting involved in local advocacy, peaceful protests, and actively supporting legal resources, education campaigns, things like that.
So the core message is that collective action is key here.
Yeah, that's the bottom line in that section. Collective action is crucial, not just to resist these trends, but also to actually reinforce democracy and make sure all voices, especially from marginalized communities, are heard and respected.
And finally, does the source point readers towards any resources if they want to learn more or get involved?
It does list a few examples. It mentions organizations like the ACLU, the National Urban League, the NAACP. It also points to the Race Forward website and, interestingly, even includes a reference to the Roaming Around podcast itself as places people could check out for more information or ways to engage. Just listed as examples provided by the source, of course.
Well, that was definitely a deep dive into the source material you shared. We've covered its arguments about historical context, the contemporary worries around policing, Project 2025, surveillance, its view of mass deportation as a potential warning, and the importance it places on solidarity and action.
It certainly lays out a powerful, interconnected argument, rooted, as it claims, in historical patterns and current events.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought drawn straight from the source material for you to think about. If, as this article argues, history consistently shows that targeting one group can lead to targeting others, what does vigilance really demand from all of us in a diverse society like ours?